Hello students, this is Professor McDermott. In this lecture we're going to focus on what were known as Jim Crow laws. These were laws passed in southern states, mostly during the 1890s, that took away black civil liberties, especially the right to vote, and also imposed segregation on African Americans in the South. For a while after the Civil War, it looked like life really was getting better for African Americans in the South and that equality was within reach. During the period of Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877, African American males did get the right to vote, and in fact, a number of African American males were even elected to public office, running on the Republican Party ticket. At this time, of course, all blacks voted Republican because um, the Republican Party, after all, had been the party that helped to free them from slavery. And so, with the help of Republican politicians, African Americans had made great strides in terms of political power in the South after the Civil War. However, beginning in the 1870s and with the help of the Ku Klux Klan, the Southern Democratic Party began the process of retaking um, the southern state governments. And this process is known as redemption. Slowly, one by one, every southern state moved from having a Republican government with black participation to having a white supremacist government dominated by the Democratic Party. Now, blacks for a while, even during the period of redemption, were allowed to vote. However, the threats and intimidation by the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacists often would force black voters to vote Democratic. At other times, Democratic candidates would bribe African Americans to vote for them rather than for the Republican Party ticket. It looked for a time as if the black voters in the South would find a home within the Populist Party, that is, the People's Party, which was powerful during the 1890s. And at first, populists in the South were open to welcoming African American voters. However, as time went on, as the 1890s went on, many poor white populists began to turn against black voters and to um, uh, seek white supremacy in their states. And partly that had to do with a backlash against a law that was proposed in 1890 by Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge called the Force Bill. This law would have protected black voters in the South by using the Army once again to support and protect black voting, as had been done during the period of Reconstruction. Now, this law was never passed, but white Southerners were so outraged um, by the fact that the force bill was even proposed that this really helped to fuel the campaign against black voting in the South. By 1896, the Democratic Party had become so powerful throughout the South that they no longer needed black voters to support their party ticket. Meanwhile, the Republican Party in the South, its leaders had decided that they wanted to get rid of their old image as quote unquote black Republicans, being supported mainly by black voters, and that they too wanted to embrace white supremacy. And so this tendency within the Republican Party was called the Lily White Republican movement. So that by the end of the 1890s, really blacks were shut out of the three political parties, and so there was no one to support them and stand up for them as their rights, one by one, were taken away during the 1890s. It's interesting, though, um, as black voting rights were taken away in the South, the one tactic that white supremacists did not use was actually passing laws saying that no blacks would be allowed to vote in the future. They couldn't do that because any such state laws would have been unconstitutional. After all, the 14th Amendment guaranteed blacks equality before the law, and the 15th Amendment guaranteed black males the right to vote. So, in order to get around the Constitution, white supremacists had to use clever methods that they devised to try to take the vote away from black males without explicitly saying that's what they were doing. One method was the literacy test. So, in a number of southern states, laws were passed that said that voters had to be able to read and write. And this discriminated against blacks, many of whom still could not read and write, although there had been many gains in terms of education during Reconstruction. Also, some states imposed poll taxes. That is, you had to pay a certain amount of money before you would be allowed to vote. And since most blacks were poor sharecroppers in the South during the late 19th century, many of them could not pay these poll taxes. Finally, the Democratic Party began to use what were called primary elections. Now, we still have these. We've just finished a campaign season with many primary elections for the Republicans and the Democrats. This was considered a very progressive reform at the time to allow voters in each party to vote for what candidates they wanted to be nominated. But in the South, the Democratic Party used primary elections to exclude black voters because they could pass rules, party rules, saying that only whites could vote in their primaries. So this was the third method of taking away the vote from blacks. Now, it's interesting that literacy tests and poll taxes especially also discriminated against poor white people, many of whom also could not read or could not afford to pay the tax. So, in a number of states, white supremacists tried to figure out ways to keep poor white voters on the voting rolls while getting rid of poor and illiterate black voters. And the favorite method of doing this was called the grandfather clause. Now, you've probably heard this term before. We use it for all kinds of things nowadays. But what it meant in the context of Jim Crow was that often the laws would say, for instance, that if your grandfather had been a voter in the South in 1860, then you too would be allowed to vote, no matter, even if you didn't meet the other requirements. And since all voters in the South in 1860 were white, this allowed a number of poor white voters to get back on the voting rolls. However, there were some white voters who were also disenfranchised, who had the vote taken away from them as a result of Jim Crow. And that was one reason why progressives and reformers throughout the country really embraced these voting reforms, surprisingly enough, because after all, we've seen how these educated white reformers were often very nervous about having, say, immigrants vote, and many of them were interested in taking away the vote from voters they considered to be unqualified or who were so poor that they might easily be bribed at the polls. And so by restricting voting, reformers hoped to eliminate corruption in elections. And so many members of the progressive movement embraced these Jim Crow voting laws, especially after 1898, after we had acquired the colonies of the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico. The example of the South, where you had a class of second-class citizens, blacks who were not allowed to vote, turned out to be a useful precedent for depriving those Filipinos and other colonial people from the right to vote as well. And so, strange as it may sound, progressives embraced Jim Crow in many ways, and although the progressive movement was good for women, for workers, for child laborers, and so forth, it was often very bad for African Americans. Before we leave this slide, I just want to mention why these discriminatory laws were called Jim Crow laws. They were named after a white musician and entertainer from the 1830s whose name was Thomas D. Rice. And as you can see from the picture here on the left, Rice would put on black makeup and dress like an African American slave, and he would sing slave songs. He was what was called a minstrel performer, and he took the stage name of Jim Crow. So he was very famous, and when these laws were passed, they were dubbed Jim Crow laws after this performer whose act was quite demeaning to African Americans. One way that repression was enforced against African Americans in the late 19th century was the practice known as lynching, which meant usually killing, hanging, or murdering in some other way an African American, normally a male, who was accused of a crime. This name, lynch law, comes from a judge in Virginia during the time of the American Revolution, who basically took the law into his own hands and dealt out very, very harsh punishments to people. Now, there were African Americans who stood up against lynching. One of the most famous was a female journalist named Ida B. Wells Barnett. Wells Barnett, in a number of books and in many newspaper articles, tried to defeat the stereotype of the black male rapist, because the justification for many lynchings was that white people believed that African American males wanted nothing more than to have sex with white women, and that they would stop at nothing to achieve that goal. And so there were many accusations of rape against black males in the South in the late 19th century, nearly all of them false. Ida B. Wells Barnett argued in her writings that, in fact, many relationships between black men and white women were consensual, that white women had not only consented to these relationships, but had, in fact, in many cases, sought them out and had initiated them. And for saying this, Ida B. Wells outraged public opinion so much that in 1892 she was driven from her home city of Memphis up to Chicago, where she continued her journalistic career, immediately getting involved in a boycott of the World's Fair, the White City World's Fair of 1893 in Chicago, which she said discriminated against African Americans. Lynching is one type of what we call vigilantism, or vigilante justice. That is, when citizens take the law into their own hands because they believe that law enforcement officials are not enforcing the laws the way they want them to be enforced. And so between 1885 and 1900, there were recorded about 2,500 lynchings of African Americans, again, mostly of men who were accused of rape. And this also helps to explain why some progressives embraced Jim Crow, and especially embraced segregation in housing during the 1890s, because progressives believed that if you could separate blacks and whites in the South so that they had less contact with each other, there would be fewer cases of lynching. So with less contact, there would be less fighting, less conflict, less resentment, and so lynching would go down. And it actually is true that once segregation began to be imposed in terms of housing and public accommodations in the 1890s, that the number of lynchings did actually go down. But it certainly did not disappear. In fact, in 1900, there were 106 recorded lynchings of African Americans in that year alone. And I want to read you a couple of comments um, that explain this epidemic of lynching. I want to apologize for the offensive language in these comments, but we're trying to understand how people at the time looked at this issue. Um, First comment from a Mississippi white citizen in 1908. He said, quote, "When there is a row, that is a fight, we feel like killing a nigger, whether he has done anything or not." All right, so you see here how African Americans often became the scapegoat for any kind of social problem in the South, and a lynching was used to defuse tension in Southern communities. Um, in the same period, a comment from a Mississippi black citizen. He said, quote, "They had to have a license to kill anything but a nigger. We was always in season," end quote. I'm going to show you some photographs that are going to be very difficult to look at and actually very painful to see. I'm doing this because I think it's very, very important for all of us to remember lynching and what African Americans suffered through lynching. On the left, you see a lynching that was carried out against Lige Daniels in the town of Center, Texas, in 1920. And Daniels was hanged by the white community, as you can see there, watching his body hang from a tree, because he was accused of murdering a white woman. The young man on the right, Jesse Washington, suffered even worse torture. Jesse Washington was accused of raping and murdering a white woman. And so, before he was actually killed, the white citizens of Waco, Texas, castrated him. They cut off his fingers one by one. And then they hanged him, but underneath the noose, they built a fire. And slowly, over a period of 2 hours, Washington was murdered and tortured to death by being raised and lowered into the fire. So you see that these lynchings were actually community events. You see the large number of white bystanders who are observing this. They were like community rituals in which the community imposed their standards of what they thought was right and wrong, and punished scapegoats who transgressed the boundaries that they set for their communities. And the next photograph, I think, in a way, is even more horrifying. This was a rather late lynching that took place actually in 1930, and I want you to note that it took place in Marion, Indiana, a northern state. And I never want to give the impression that racism was confined to the South. Actually, white people all over the country shared many racist opinions, and the Ku Klux Klan was quite active in the North, and there were many lynchings also that took place north of the Mason-Dixon line. These two young men were accused of murdering a white man, a factory worker, and also of raping his girlfriend, although she later retracted her story and admitted she had not been raped. But it was too late to save Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith, who were hanged in Marion, Indiana. But what I find so awful about this picture, if you take a look at the faces of the white onlookers, again, these lynchings could often have a kind of festival atmosphere, almost like it was a fair. You see on the left a young man grinning, presumably there with his date next to him. You see the general mood of cheerfulness. There is a man in the middle who's pointing up at one of the victims as if to say, "This will happen to you too if you violate the code of white supremacy," and so forth. And what makes this really upsetting is that the reason we have these pictures is that actually after lynchings, often photographs of lynchings were sold as postcards. So, for instance, after a lynching, you could go down to the local drugstore and buy a postcard, and you could send it to your mom or your grandma at home. Look, we had this wonderful lynching. It was a great time. Wish you were here. Um, so, truly shocking, but something that we need to remember and that we need to be aware of, so that we can all make sure that nothing like this ever happens again in our country. Um, let's turn to segregation in public places. This is the kind of segregation that perhaps we're more familiar with: separate bathrooms, separate water fountains, white and black people living in separate places. How did this type of Jim Crow law come about? Well, the Supreme Court in 1883 really opened the way for racial segregation when it ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional. And in this decision, the Supreme Court said that the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution had prohibited states from discriminating on the basis of race, but it did not prohibit individuals, let's say business owners, from discriminating against black customers. And so this decision essentially allowed black business owners to create separate facilities for black and white customers. The practice of segregation was tested again before the Supreme Court in 1896 in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy was an African American who sued a railroad company because he had been forced to sit in a segregated railroad car. And in this Plessy versus Ferguson case, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was constitutional and legal, not only in public accommodations like railroads, but also in schools, as long as the separate facilities provided were equal. So the famous quote, "separate but equal," meant that separate facilities could be provided for blacks and whites, but theoretically they were supposed to be of equal quality. Now, in practice, that was almost never true. And if you want to see evidence of this, you can go downtown in Albany to the local Civil Rights Museum and see the difference between the black and white waiting rooms at the local Albany bus station. Black schools, too, although they had dedicated black teachers, were not given the same level of financial support as white schools, and black students often had to make do with old textbooks and had almost no equipment as part of their education. Now, in response to Jim Crow, African Americans took a number of different approaches. One approach was pioneered by a bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Henry M. Turner, who decided that things were so bad for African Americans that the only thing to do was to go back to Africa. And so he began to try to organize people to move back to Africa to escape from Jim Crow. He said on one occasion, he said, quote, "Hell is an improvement upon the United States when the Negro is involved." So the idea was the U.S. is so bad that we have to move back to our African homeland. But most African Americans really were not that interested in going back to Africa. After all, they had been born here, they grew up here, they spoke English, and they were Americans. And this was their country, no matter how badly it had treated them. And so the Back to Africa movement really did not get a whole lot of support. And most African American leaders were committed to remaining in America, at least. And some of them were even committed to remaining in the South, especially Booker T. Washington, the president of the Tuskegee Institute. Over on the right, you see the faculty of this very famous black college in 1902. In the front row center is George Washington Carver, a very important scientist who I personally love because he invented my favorite food, peanut butter. So we have Carver to thank for that. But Booker T. Washington became the most famous African American spokesman in the late 1890s, especially after a really famous speech he gave here in Georgia at a gathering called the Cotton States Exposition in Atlanta in September of 1895. And you'll have this speech. Actually, all groups will read an excerpt from this speech, so I don't want to go into too great detail. But essentially, Washington argues that blacks had tried to go too far too fast during the Reconstruction period, that instead of trying to seek high political office, African Americans should instead try to work their way up slowly, and they should start with very ordinary, practical kinds of jobs, like being a farmer, like being a waiter, like being a Pullman car porter on the railroads, or what have you. That they should then educate themselves, try to get practical skills, so that eventually they could work their way up in society. Washington also seemed in this speech to accept segregation. He didn't actually come out and say he was in favor of segregation, but he made this statement, quote, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress," end quote. So you see, he seems in a kind of backhanded way to endorse separation between the races in many aspects of life, even though he calls for unity in terms of promoting the progress of the South. Well, you can see why white people loved the message of Booker T. Washington, which became known as Bookerism. It seemed to support segregation and support the idea that blacks needed to at least start off in a very lowly way and not be too aggressive or too assertive. So after he finished the speech, historian David Blight describes the reaction in Atlanta, quote, "White women threw flowers and blacks wept in the aisles as the white dignitaries on the stage swarmed gleefully about the orator," end quote. So at least in the mind of white America, Booker T. Washington was the main black leader. This was a man they felt they could work with. It should be said, in all fairness to Washington, that he did work behind the scenes to try to stop lynching, for instance, and to stop the more serious examples of injustice in the South, even while he publicly refused to attack the Jim Crow laws. However, all was not well in the South even after the beginning of Bookerism, and that should have been clear from the fact that only 1 month after he gave the speech in Atlanta, there was a huge race riot in which 25 African Americans were killed. Not all blacks agreed with Booker T. Washington, and in fact, there were a number of African American leaders who really didn't like Bookerism. There was in a newspaper, a black newspaper in Atlanta called the Atlanta Advocate, and whenever they referred to Booker T. Washington, they called him by the name Bad Taste Wash to show their contempt for Washington's ideas. But the main spokesman in the African American community against Booker T. Washington was W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a sociologist. He was an academic. He was a professor in Atlanta at an African American school, and he was the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard University. So he was a very high-powered scholar who in 1903 came out with a very famous book called The Souls of Black Folk, which is an extensive treatment of African American folk culture that still is widely read to this day. In 1905, Du Bois and a group of his friends met at Niagara Falls and formed what was called the Niagara Movement. And essentially the goal of the Niagara Movement was to try to defeat Jim Crow and to resist the ideas of Booker T. Washington. The Niagara Movement petered out over the next few years. But in 1910, um, Du Bois joined the board of the NAACP, that is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It's interesting, when this group started, it was actually founded by white Americans who were sympathetic to the plight of blacks. And in 1910, Du Bois actually was the only African American on their board of directors. But of course, over time, the NAACP became one of the preeminent African American groups lobbying for improvement of conditions for blacks in America. And also, all groups will have a piece by Du Bois in response to Booker T. Washington, and you'll have a chance to debate the issues between them on our discussion boards. So I look forward very much to that discussion. I want to end this lecture with a man who became a very important symbol of black resistance as part of the sporting world. He was known as the Galveston Giant from Galveston, Texas. Jack Johnson was the first African American to hold the heavyweight boxing championship of the world from 1908 to 1915. Now, Jack Johnson was everything that frightened white Americans during this time. He was very tall, extremely powerful African American male who refused to conform to the standards that white society tried to impose on blacks during this period. And after he got the championship in 1908, many white Americans really wanted Jack Johnson to be defeated and the championship to go back to a white male. So an earlier champion named James Jeffries, who had retired undefeated, was coaxed out of retirement to fight Johnson in 1910, and Jeffries became known as the quote-unquote hope of the white race. But Johnson defeated Jeffries handily in this fight in 1910, a fight which sparked bloody and violent race riots all over the country. And you can see sort of the depth of the contempt that many white sports fans had for Johnson in a headline from the San Francisco Examiner about the fight. Quote, "Jeffries mastered by grinning, jeering Negro," end quote. The thing that Johnson did that was most controversial was that everywhere he went, he traveled with a large entourage which was entirely composed of white women. And so this tended to reinforce the stereotype of the black male who only wanted to sleep with white women. By the way, I need to detour here something I meant to say earlier. There was another stereotype that was prevalent in the South, the stereotype of the ignorant Negro legislator. That is, those blacks who had gotten themselves elected to political office during Reconstruction, but who were considered by many whites to be unqualified for their task, too ignorant to serve the public in that role. And later in the course, we're going to watch a very offensive and racist film called The Birth of a Nation, part of it, that brings out both of these stereotypes, the black male racist and the ignorant Negro legislator. So just keep that in mind when we do watch that film. But back to Johnson. There was a federal law called the Mann Act, which said that nobody was allowed to transport a woman across state lines for immoral purposes. And in 1912, Jack Johnson, the heavyweight champion of the world, was actually indicted and put on trial for violating the Mann Act because he took these white women with him everywhere he went. And he was convicted and put in jail. But somehow, through bribery, he managed to get out of jail and to flee to Mexico, where he lived for the next 3 years. In Mexico in 1915, he finally defended his crown against Jess Willard and actually lost to Willard, and so that was the end of his reign as the heavyweight champion. But Jack Johnson really became an unforgettable figure for many African Americans, and an example of the great impact that sports and sporting events can actually have on history.